Здравствуйте, дорогие слушатели! Мы начинаем 54-й эпизод Security Satin подкаста. У нас сегодня в гостях Kenneth Geers, и поскольку меня все предали, со мной сегодня Виктор Жара и должен прийти Константин Корсун. Okay, Kenneth.
Yes.
We will start.
Okay.
Can you say some words about you? What are you doing? Who are you? What are your primary job, maybe, or some interesting project?
Yeah, so I'm basically a cyber defense analyst, computer network security, writer, thinker. I was 20 years in the US government, and then I worked for FireEye after that. Now I'm primarily doing think tank work, and I basically am looking at strategic issues in cybersecurity from a global perspective. What I'm really concerned about is how hacking and how information technology in general, but especially security issues and the abuse of information technology, are used by governments for political and military purposes. So espionage, war, even pure politics. So how does a leader stay in power via internet ownership and manipulation? So I look at a wide range of, especially cases that are easy to see: the Arab-Israeli conflict, elections in countries with poor human rights records, U.S.-China military preparations in the Pacific. Issues like this concern me very much. What impact has the internet had on political, military, espionage domains and issues?
Oh, of course.
Hey, hello guys.
Hi.
Are you speaking English today?
Yeah.
Hey, Kenneth.
Hello.
Okay, Kenneth told some words about himself. Today we would like to speak about Kenneth's books and about what you can say about. What can you tell about your book and about practice part of it?
So, one of the things that always fascinated me is the interplay between information technology and in politics and military affairs. So my particular perspective, say, on the Arab-Israeli conflict is how is it playing out in cyberspace? So since I'm living in Kiev in Ukraine, I was asked basically to edit a book on the cyber dimension of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So I asked more than 20 authors to give me their perspectives. And so I have a global perspective, I have technical analysis of particular attacks, I have legal analysis on how international law is affected by computers and computer network use and abuse in this particular conflict. So, there are so many things. On the political side in Ukraine, we saw an election that was hacked. And the military domain, we see lines that were physically cut and forensics on computers that are in eastern Ukraine today that would indicate sort of a degree of political surveillance and oppression that citizens don't really want. In diplomacy, we saw U.S. diplomats had their communications basically captured, uploaded to YouTube, and announced on Twitter. In the business space, we saw the hacking of TV sets that displayed Russian propaganda. In social media space, we see fake accounts that are created and then are used to disseminate political opinions about the conflict. So really, in every domain, one of the things that I see is that the Ukraine conflict shows us that every domain today is seriously impacted by the use and abuse of information technology. So there is a clear cyber dimension to any political military conflict today. One of the things that many of the authors had commented on was that there had been no spectacular cyber attacks. In other words, there were so many examples of particular computer network operations or hacks or attacks in cyberspace. But 3 weeks after the book came out, there was the power grid attacks in western Ukraine. That it's possible, if the forensics and the analysis basically shows that it was a malicious attack, international attack, it will place Western Ukraine sort of in the same category as Iran with Stuxnet and the targeting of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, because it's a precedent. Everyone knew that the power grid was vulnerable. The connectivity is there. The computer vulnerabilities and exploits exist. So experts were waiting to see if in a geopolitical crisis, or even in peacetime, hackers would begin to manipulate the power grid or infrastructure. And it's a really important issue because everything depends on power. So computer networks also depend on power. Hospitals, libraries, government, and even each of us in our own apartment at night. There's a big difference between turning on the lamp and lighting a candle, for example. So the book is basically about the cyber dimension of the conflict here, and it's something I've been doing for well over 10 years now, looking at the cyber dimension of the Arab-Israeli conflict, of the U.S.-China issue, of human rights as well. So in this day and age, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that computers and hacking, cyberspace, internet, they're all incredibly important in everything that takes place today, but especially in terms of geopolitical conflict, because generals, admirals, presidents, and prime ministers, they all have a vast bureaucracy at their disposal to levy national security requirements upon them in order to fulfill political and military goals on behalf of a nation state, and that's what I'm interested in. And frankly, in the Ukraine Russia case study, you can see quite a lot of activity.
Guys, are you have any question?
Sure, yeah, of course. It's interesting. I know, Kenneth, I remember initially when we met each other a couple of years ago, yes, you told me about your research about connection of political events and hacktivism activities or cybercrime activities, yes. And now this research is very interesting as well. But what do you think? You told about maybe a big influence into the power grid, about politicians, about study, libraries, yes, government. Nowadays, we know that Ukrainian level of informatization in Ukraine is quite low, yes, especially to compare to United States or Western Europe. Do you really think that it's very important to, current level of informatization in Ukraine? Could it influence into real life of people in Ukraine? We know that level of informatization in US is very, very high, and law enforcement and special agency can protect them from hackers' attacks, cyber espionage, etc. So what would you say about, you live in Kiev for years, a couple of years, as I remember, yes. What can you say about how modern Ukraine can protect our infrastructure against computer attacks?
Well, I think that a lot of the activity is moving perhaps toward social media and attacks on individuals, because decision makers, influential people within any society today, they have a little supercomputer in their pocket in the form of a smartphone. And there is so much, I think, espionage as well as influence operations ongoing. I would think actually Ukraine is fairly progressive in terms of information technology across the board in the world. I mean, all of my students and friends are quite wired in this country. Bandwidth is good, speed is fast. Everyone, I think, has social media accounts. This space will be targeted. It's very important because the hearts and minds, I think, of the citizens of Ukraine are ultimately one of the biggest prizes. Information operations, I think, personnel, whether they're in any country, they will be interested in affecting public opinion in Ukraine. And some of that will be channeled through political parties and political events here in Ukraine. Some of it will just be appealing to philosophical issues, historical, cultural, linguistic issues. But I think that basically, compared to so many countries, I think actually Ukraine is very wired and very informatized. There are many people who are interested in the power grid attacks in Western Ukraine. Some of the analysis has been, well, in Ukraine it was at least possible to manually fix the system, whereas in some countries, perhaps like the United States, it's so IT dependent that nobody could possibly go out and flip switches because the country perhaps is larger and is more dependent on software. So in a certain sense, the size of the country could help. I know in Estonia, for example, in 2007, one of the real benefits was that all of these guys are basically Banya buddies, right? The IT guys, as well as the defense minister and those in the presidential office, they were all able to get together really quickly and analyze the situation and come up with some defenses for what was a very large-scale denial of service attack. Ukraine, of course, will have its own special challenges in terms of size and organizational issues. But the book we wrote and the subsequent power attack in Western Ukraine may be very appropriately timed in order to help Ukraine chart a course for the future, to sort of build sort of interagency cooperation in terms of fusion of information and intelligence in order to understand threats and to defend against them, because it does require sharing of information and speed of response. And so nothing that's happened so far in Ukraine is especially dire in terms of, in the IT space anyway, in terms of cyber attack. But the fact that 80,000 residents were without power for 6 hours, it should be enough to show us that problem is real and it needs to be addressed. So I know I have probably got so many phone calls, many more on this issue than on any other issue since I have been living in Kiev, from colleagues and cyber defense researchers around the world, basically wanting a little bit more information. So the world's eyes currently are on Ukraine in terms of IT security, that's for sure. But Ukraine is really standing, I think, on a challenges basically they offer you huge opportunities. Ukraine, I think, is filled with talent and filled with a knowledge of history as well that so many people lack. For example, those who are writing on Russia in the United States, they don't have nearly the experience, background, expertise, and obviously linguistic capability that average researcher in Kiev does. In terms of IT talent, just hardcore coding expertise, hacker expertise, there is as much talent here as there is anywhere. So because of the geopolitical conflict, because of these precedents that are being set in terms of hacking in support of geopolitical events, including the power grid attack, I mean, I could see, honestly, I think in 5 years you will see Ukraine as could be a world leader in terms of cybersecurity, cyber defense, security companies. It has to be. It must be. It makes me want to really stay here and live here and start my own company, because it's all there for the taking, I think. The cybersecurity is all greenfield, which means that it is all ready for plowing and ready for planting and harvesting. Everything is new. Right here in Ukraine, if this power grid attack basically turns out to be an accurate story, you have a world first right here in Ukraine, the first malicious attack on a power grid in history in your country. And you can use that as well. It's a challenge for sure, but it's also an opportunity. And then I think the level of knowledge in IT, as well as the expertise and potential here, are as high as anywhere in the world.
As I remember, it happens very similar attacks against American US power stations. No? Victor, do you remember that?
Yes, surely. I'd like to ask what are real steps that Ukraine should go through to become a leader in cybersecurity in 5 years, as you say?
Yeah, I think transparency is such an important issue. We've struggled with this in the United States, and I think every country does. There are these classification issues that always stand in the way. I have my secrets, I have my data, and I can't show them to you unless I know you or unless you have the right clearance. I think in the modern IT space, this is the wrong approach. I think we need to be open to sharing of information and intelligence, public discussion and presentation of the information. For example, at the end of the Soviet period, there's a very worthwhile discussion ongoing in the United States on whether the United States was absolutely doing itself a disservice by so much classified information that we couldn't really discuss what was going on in the Soviet Union. It was all classified, and it was all very narrow-minded analysis and focus. And what we needed to do was talk about the problem in public forums more. In cybersecurity, I think the same situation applies. We need to talk about the vulnerabilities, the connectivity issues with critical infrastructure, exploits, and then agencies within Ukraine and elsewhere should be sharing information, working together. That's a fusion of information and intelligence, and a lot of it's very personality-based. So those who work within different agencies, they should know each other personally. And they should, go to sauna, banya together. They should be working, having beers together, going to conferences together. But all of this, especially in the age of the internet, is important. It's about learning, sharing information. There's a real interesting gap between technical expertise in cybersecurity and strategic understanding and knowledge. And one of the things you have to do is bring together different expertise in order to, in common, work on a problem. Because very hardcore technical personnel, they're very, very busy with building and breaking things. They don't necessarily have time to see how the electrons jump from the network to cyberspace, or from sort of machine code to human code. And the intentions of information operations personnel, spies, military people, when they hack something, it's usually for a larger purpose. It's for a political military goal. So you do need a team of people working together from different agencies, different backgrounds, in order to understand the problem. And the only way you're going to do that is basically by sharing information and bringing people together from different agencies and different backgrounds to discuss the problem. So I know in the United States we have this classic problem of what we call stovepiping. So that means basically, I've got my pot of money, or I've got my database, or my own classification, and I'm very proud of that, and I can't really share it with you. And as we saw, even with, before 9/11 and the terrorist attacks in New York and everything, that was one of the biggest problems, is the CIA and the FBI and other agencies basically didn't work together very well in order to share information about the threats and the problems. All the information existed, but it just wasn't shared. So in Ukraine, I don't know the Ukrainian government structure and challenges very well, but I would encourage Ukraine basically to say, we probably have all the information we need, but we need to share it, and we need to discuss it, not only between ourselves, but in public, so that people understand the problem and people can make progress on the problem in order to mitigate it or to correct the challenges.
we have the same situation in Ukraine, and a new cyber strategy that hopefully should be confirmed by the president should help avoid this miscoordination between different agencies, and hopefully we will choose this right variant. Kos, your turn.
Oh yeah, to make our conversation less formal, probably. Kenneth, as you mentioned, your book came out maybe 3 weeks before the incident at power stations in Ukraine. Yes.
I couldn't quite hear that. You said 3 or 4 weeks before the power grid attack.
Yeah. So since those times, those incidents happened. Yes. And a lot of experts from FBI, from Secretary of Energy of United States, guys from NASA, from and any other American agency came to Ukraine and had some evidences here about the incident. They thought that by their hands, saw by their eyes. All our law enforcement, Ukrainian law enforcement, had. So, would it be this material be enough for your next book?
Perhaps. I think everyone, I can promise you this, is interested in the power grid attacks, because it will place Ukraine as Iran and Estonia in it'll have a marker on the timeline of the ultimate timeline of cyber attack and cyber warfare history. Iran being the first wholly digital military operation, Estonia being a political retaliation for a test, if you will, of cyber war and political coercion via the networks in practice. There are numerous case studies previously. You could argue that Chechnya was political propaganda in action, showing the power of websites, not only to display casualties, but also to raise money for arms. Kosovo, when the war there over the fate of that Serbian province, it was a clear display of non-state hackers basically taking on NATO at the end of the 90s. There are many examples, but with Ukraine, it could be that Ukraine will occupy that place as the first publicly known power grid attack that took place that actually was effective during a crisis, a political or a geopolitical crisis, which is no small thing. Like I said, I haven't received nearly so many phone calls on any topic since I've been here from researchers really all over the world. So the analysis, of course, everyone will be interested in, and it needs to be confirmed. The internet is nothing if not a place for sort of international false flagging, intrigue, and chicanery, basically the use of the networks to play games. But it seems like, from what I can see in the news, there's an increasing belief that it was a malicious international cyber attack, in which case it will open really new territory in terms of cyber attack and defense, not only from a case study standpoint, from a legal standpoint. The lawyers, I've been involved in the Tallinn Manual on International Law as it applies to cyber warfare, that process, and the lawyers are very interested in anything that would have casualties, that would be considered an act of war on the part of a president, basically. And when you turn the lights out in cities, such that people are in the dark for hours, many thousands of people, that will begin to fall into the category of an act of war, basically. Because what's the difference if you turn it off via software or if you bomb a factory? And in many cases, it's funny. I went to a talk by the CIA director some years ago, and the director said, he said, why would it be better actually to bomb a factory than to hack it? Nobody responded, and he said the reason is because you could choose to bomb a factory today, but hacking actually requires weeks, months, or even years of sustained subversion on the part of professional hackers. And he said this is really a bad precedent for the world. In other words, if critical infrastructure is under constant attack in peacetime in order to prepare for possible wartime scenarios. This is really a dangerous precedent to set, and is something that will lead to eternal chaos on the networks during peacetime, which is something that should scare all of us, really, because we all rely on power, basically, to light our homes and to power our computers as well. So when the power goes out, it is really, really serious. And so any time that the power grid is threatened, it doesn't matter if it's a physical attack or a cyber attack, I think it's going to be treated very seriously from a national security perspective. And that's why so many people are interested in the attacks here and have been sending forensics experts and analysts to find out what happened.
And US specialists help a lot in investigation and attribution of these attacks. We all read the report of Energy Deputy Minister of the United States and so on. Kenneth, to your opinion, what conclusions can be made by American specialists to raise the level of protection of United States power grid system?
Well, from the Ukraine case study, if it turns out to be accurate, then of course the level of funding and focus on the power grid will rise significantly, I promise you, because the precedent will have been set that you can do this. Not only is it possible, but it has been done, right? In the course of a political military conflict, we have seen international hackers basically go after the power systems. So all over the world, it doesn't matter if you're in South Africa, India, China, or the US, or Russia, there will be an increased focus on power systems, because if it's been done before, it'll be done again. And I think usually during the course of a war, the gloves come off and the goal is to win. And it's to win quickly and efficiently. And the international law perspective is secondary. Really, if you're responsible, you're the president, you're responsible for winning a war, you tend to bend the rules. And looking at post-war pictures of London, Dresden, and Tokyo, you can see that international law during wartime is not really followed so much as it is paid lip service to. Right? So, but in the United States, there will be a lot of interest in this, because we know that in the United States that the power grid is quite vulnerable. And according to the U.S. government, there have been multiple foreign intelligence agencies that have been placing malware within our networks, right? Not only within power grids, but in Wall Street, for example, threatening the economic system of the United States. So that's a challenge, because if it basically ties the president's hands somewhat in regarding national security crises and options, right? Because if the president is afraid that Wall Street will go dark, if tensions with Iran or Russia or China raise above a certain level, then that basically is a serious impediment to freedom of action and promotion of U.S. national interest. And basically not just talking about the U.S., but it applies to any country. And so it's funny that in the Cold War we had this concept of mutually assured destruction. We can destroy you with nuclear weapons and you can destroy us. In the cyber age, people talk about mutually assured disruption, in that if Moscow turned out the lights in Washington, Washington could turn out the lights in Moscow. And of course that's an interesting scenario, and it might well be true. It might be a lot more tempting and even easy to do that than it would be to launch a nuclear weapon. However, it does give decision makers new options in terms of threats and in terms of deterrence, right? If Russia would like to deter the United States from freedom of action in Syria or in Estonia or in Ukraine, Russia could threaten the power grid in the United States, and it's true in the opposite direction as well. The cyber attacks basically are a new way, a new form of power for a student, a professor, and a soldier and a spy in order to do their job more effectively, more efficiently, with greater reach, greater knowledge of vulnerabilities in their opponent's armor and their infrastructure. And so there's no doubt about we will see kinds of cyber Pearl Harbors in the future. A lot of people don't like the analogy to cyber Pearl Harbor, but I actually think it's quite effective because the Japanese certainly didn't intend to win World War II when they attacked at Hawaii, and it was also a mistake, right? It was a mistake that came back to haunt them very quickly because I think it was less than 6 months before Tokyo was bombed, right, by the U.S. Air Force. So launching a cyber attack is interesting because you had better have the political and military might in order to back it up. But Russia certainly does. You know, a small country may not dare to launch a powerful cyber attack because if you can do attribution, then the retaliation will be overwhelming. But Russia certainly is large enough and populous enough and strong enough to perhaps not worry about the counterattack, right? And so that may apply to many, many large countries. But in cyberspace, I think currently we see a lot of signaling going on, a lot of testing going on of cyber tactics, cyber operations, strategies, and the power grid attack in Ukraine. I think it was inevitable. If we didn't see it here, we would see it in another conflict somewhere. Because everybody wants to know, could I do this? Am I going to get a response from the United Nations or from the adversary? In other words, if I turn out the power in Ukraine, are the lights going to go out in Moscow? We saw that with North Korea. A lot of this, of course, is unclear, but when North Korea was upset about this film that Sony Pictures had completed on the death, the assassination of its leader, then North Korea had evidently conducted a powerful cyber attack against Sony Pictures. But it is widely believed that the United States then conducted a bit of a test of a counterattack against North Korea. In terms of shutting off their access to the internet for a period of time. When Stuxnet was launched against Iran, in the aftermath of that, it's widely believed that Iran then targeted facilities in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and in the United States as a way to test the waters of counterattack. So we'll see if this pans out, and it really was believed that a foreign intelligence service conducted a power grid attack in Ukraine. Perhaps somebody somewhere is going to send a message to Moscow by turning off the lights for 6 hours.
Kenneth, many Ukrainian experts believe that main problem of last December power grid attack was stupidity of system administrators, first of all. Of a power station system administrator, because not every network should be connected to internet. Not every network can have an opportunity to manage directly the power station, or maybe some switches or some users, etc., etc. So, and I can agree, by the way, I'm not sure it was the first time of successful attack against the power station. It happened many times before in Europe and in the United States, maybe 10 years ago or 7 years ago. And now in Ukraine, in conditions of absence of strong regulations on the matter, absence of provision of what is the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and as you said, no cooperation between many authorities, between society, between community, and maybe some regulators, etc. No rules at all. Formally saying, if we talk about SCADA systems. So what would you say? Can we rely on maybe something like NATO Cyber Center of Excellence in Ukraine, maybe the next year, as a source of NATO, European Union, set up something Center of Excellence? Okay, so my question is, do you hear me, Kenneth?
Yeah, I got most of it.
Yeah, most of it. So I will repeat my last question. I told many times. What do you think? can Ukraine rely on something like that our friends, U.S., European Union, could set up something like Center of Excellence in Ukraine to protect power grid systems? Or like
I think so. I think that in cybersecurity is one of the areas where there is the most money available today. Even if funding is being cut around the world for education and for many services, information technology and cybersecurity are one area that everyone is investing in. Now, I think that Ukraine can absolutely benefit from this global trend. You have the talent here. You have a strong education system, and Kiev is a place where people will invest in the future because it's relatively high return on investment, given that very expensive to open an office in London, very expensive in Brussels, but a bit cheaper in Kiev, with plenty of talent here. So I think that Ukraine could easily capitalize on its strong education. The fact that it sits, frankly, at such a strategic point on the globe. Everyone here understands Russian perfectly well, speaks Russian. It's a wonderful mix, I think, of talent and opportunity. So, if I were a Ukrainian businessman, I would definitely be opening a cybersecurity business here in Kiev. It's just the time for it anywhere in the world, but especially at such a strategic location with so much knowledge, not only of IT, but also of history and culture and geopolitical issues. So I think also the EU, NATO, the Center of Excellence in Estonia, U.S. partners in the Middle East. You're sitting very close, strategic point between East and West. Not only that, but you know Moscow very well, right? You know researchers there. You speak the language. All of these things should be ideal to position researchers here to play a really important role in the world. I mean, if you think about it, Russian hackers, Chinese hackers, Iranian hackers, they have a real strong advantage in that they have a language perhaps that a lot of American analysts, let's say, or other foreign analysts to them do not speak. But here, of course, there's a sort of a important strategic position that Kiev and Ukraine occupy in the world that you can take advantage of, right? We know this area, we know former Soviet Union, we know Russia. Not only that, but we know, Poland, the Baltics, as well as our neighbors to the immediate west, and the Middle East. You're sitting sort of in a very, very important strategic part of the world. And of course, like Poland or the Baltics or Finland, of course, sometimes that can be a scary position to be in because you're vulnerable to some degree. But every time there's a challenge in life, the wise also look for the opportunity, right? And where they can use the challenge for benefit. Because if you're sitting in the middle of Nebraska, in the middle of the United States, you just don't have the perspective that an analyst or a researcher in this part of the world would. And you can use that to your advantage. So I think that not only should Ukrainians be excited about the future for understanding IT and IT security, but you will find that international institutions the world over will pay good money and will come to visit and buy your products because also they recognize that you have something that they can't possibly have, right? Just given your expertise and your knowledge.
As regards to expertise and knowledge, Kenneth, you have clinics, lecturers in Kiev University. Could you point out main weaknesses and main strengths of your students and probably educational system of Ukraine in whole?
Yeah, so my students have been really tremendous. I have one group that participate in international court cases, moot court cases, and they've done really well. They scored in the top, 10%, let's say, of all the teams that went last year. And I'm helping them again this year. And by the way, the international criminal court cases for students is very focused last year and this year on cybersecurity. So it's all about, they have a Snowden-like case. They have an Estonia-like case that they're working in terms, it's a very hot topic. But the students are terrific. I can promise you, at least one of my students, she writes better than most Americans that I know in English, right? So quite talented, smart, and future-oriented, I think. So for me, it's just exciting to learn from them every day, really, as I work in this course. I'm doing a strategic cybersecurity course that looks at what is information technology, the advent of the internet, e-society, e-governance, what is cyber espionage, cyber warfare. We also look at science fiction. We look at questions for the future, and we watch some movies and talk about them that are sort of portraying where the IT and cybersecurity are going to be a generation from now, which nobody knows that. But even a couple of years from now, basically, it's very hard to predict because things are moving so quickly. And that's one of the things I'm excited to work with students at a university about, because I'm already getting old, but students, they're living at a time when things are changing so fast that it's hard to predict, what they should be doing, because a couple of years from now the world will already look different. It didn't used to be that way a generation or two ago, and certainly before that. But today, I think with artificial intelligence and robotics and just the existence of the internet and cyberspace, to share information, to peer review information, it's really tremendous, I think. So a lot of my students, of course, they'll have a Kontakte account as well as a Facebook account. So it shows again that they're sitting in the middle of a very dynamic space. They've got, Russian or Ukrainian language, as well as English language or other conversations ongoing within social media. And again, that's a huge advantage that students here have over, let's say the average student in the United States or in France. People who here are or will be soon very bilingual, and they'll be able to operate very quickly and efficiently across two very large spaces and very large linguistic terrain. Right, which is pretty exciting. I mean, trust me, I study Russian all the time, and it's very, very difficult for me to imagine that I will ever get really good at it because it's very hard, right? But I think very soon the students here will have a very natural fluency and facility, both in the East and the West, in terms of linguistic capability. So that's also very exciting and very, very fun to see and experience. But my students are great. They're very inquisitive. They're very interested. And cybersecurity is a topic that applies to everyone. It's really great because it doesn't matter if you're a law student or a technical student or a history student. Basically, if you master IT and IT skills, you really further your career. And even if you're a grandparent, you still probably are going to do some communication online to include some banking or government services online. And so everyone gets the computer security thing. You can explain to them basically a man-in-the-middle attack, right? Somebody can get in the middle of your conversation. They can prevent you from reading it. They can steal your communication just to read it for espionage or theft. Or, most disturbingly, they can change your communication in the middle, right? They can change your numbers in your bank account, or they can change the content in your email such that you're saying, I won't meet you on Wednesday, but I'll meet you on Friday. In a national security context, that's of course very, very serious because in a man-in-the-middle attack, you could say, well, the colonel is telling the captain to send the soldiers not right but left, not forward but backward. All of those kinds of things are quite possible. In a national security context, of course, cybersecurity plays a very, very serious role. But my students are terrific at the university, and I'm just a little bit jealous of them already. I mean, I'm excited to be living at this era too. But when you consider that even my children, they have a facility with programs and with communications online that I could never have because already my brain doesn't work that quickly anymore. They've got several tabs open with several social media or academic applications open and numerous conversations ongoing in each. So perhaps total, they've got 10 conversations going. A person who went to college like I did, when you still had to look through books in the library at night, paper books, and look through indexes and highlight text the old-fashioned way, it is really amazing even to see what students are doing today, right? But their children, again, 5, 10, 20 years from now, there's really no way to predict what is going to happen. And so, especially in Ukraine, that's occupying such a dynamic, pivotal, sort of geographic position in the world, it's very hard to predict, I think, the future politics here for sure.
Hey, Kenneth, as I know, you're a visiting professor at National University Tarasa Shevchenko, as I know. And what do you teach to your students, and in what language?
So I wish I could speak Ukrainian or Russian. I do study Russian quite seriously, but the mastery of it really is elusive, I think, for even a good student, because it's a difficult language. But I teach in English, and the students are all quite fine in understanding and communicating. But I teach a high-level course called Strategic Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and International Relations. So what I look at is sort of how information technology is impacting government, military, espionage, and how, especially within a national security space, computers and the internet are changing everything that politicians, generals, national security thinkers, how they understand, how they operate in the world. So decision makers as well. And I think that, frankly, most people who are in positions of real power in the world, they probably don't yet understand just how different the world has already changed underneath their feet. But those are the lectures that I give. They sort of have to do with understanding what modern information technology is, how it's used, especially in a national security context. So I do like looking at science fiction movies and try to think a couple of years out, because in many cases, there are so many technologies that already exist, but they just haven't been sort of absorbed and incorporated into our lives and into the public domain yet. And so it's really important. Some of the best science fiction basically is about things that are going to happen a year or two from now, but we just haven't quite seen them yet. So I saw an interview with Elon Musk today online, and he says he hopes to be buried on Mars, right? Which I thought was a bit surprising, but I think he's quite serious. And so, but that's someone who's looking farther out than most people in terms of the possibilities within his lifetime. And one of the things that excites me most about having an opportunity to be at university is that I can see these kids, they're half my age, right? So I'm 47 and they're 20, 21. They're less than half my age. But basically, it's a wonderful opportunity to kind of see what is happening today in terms of technology that is difficult for someone a generation older to even understand. So I'll ask them, wow, what are you seeing on social media today? Or have you seen, I talk about information operations sort of from a national security perspective. Do you think you see governments lying in cybersecurity? Absolutely we do, and here's examples. But it's something I can think about from a theoretical perspective, and they see it more in a practical way, because they're all much more advanced in social media than I ever will be, because these tools not only are built for, but actually by programmers and entrepreneurs that are much younger than I am. So it's fun to be at university. But that's what it's about. I'm trying to share some of what I have learned by working 20 years in government as an intelligence analyst with the younger generation, because I think sometimes they have trouble understanding how governments operate and how militaries think and how spies think, right? So that's one of the things I want to share with the students, basically, a little bit, is how national security decision makers might think about influencing them or exploiting them via networks and via social media. So it's a little bit of an interplay, I think, between professor and student to try and share and to learn, but it's definitely both ways. It's certainly not, I'm young enough that I think I understand that the learning process is not unidirectional. It's not from professor to student. It's actually, I try to learn just as much as I am, just as much as they would in class. And I think I probably learn as much or more from the students as they do from me.
Okay, Ken, let's try to look to the future. We have first incident in power grid attacks. So I suppose that besides real harm, it was a kind of probing. How far can we go in the destruction of IT infrastructure? Could you predict what shall be next? What threat could be open after exploding of this kind of attacks on power grid system?
Well, the power grid system attack is very serious, there's no doubt, because basically all other infrastructures, they need electricity to operate, unless you have a big battery, you know. But I think almost everything is liable to hacking by foreign intelligence and foreign military services, including weapon systems. So, even tanks, planes, ships, all of these military weapons platforms, they need internet connectivity in order to operate efficiently and successfully in the modern era. And I promise you that we will see some spectacular operations in which, I'm not going to say it's easy, but let's say you have a couple of tank armies that are on the field of battle, right? They're getting ready to attack each other on the plains of Europe somewhere. It is at least theoretically possible that one army will have a zero-day exploit that literally will turn the other side off, right? Or two air forces are getting ready to have dogfights in the sky, right, over a smaller country in the middle. You will see that one country will have a zero-day exploit that the other country doesn't know about, and basically renders either the weapon systems, the planes themselves, or the pilots absolutely incapable of operating, right, during conflict scenario. China, for example, they build all of the computers that are probably used in the U.S. military. Have they built in backdoors into the systems, into the hardware, that basically would allow them sort of some kind of permanent denial of service capability over the U.S. Navy? I promise you that the U.S. Navy is looking at this issue and wondering, when they buy computers that are made in China, do they come with a backdoor such that if there is a war over Taiwan, China would be able to turn the computers off, such that the U.S. Navy would be incapable of operating in a combat environment? I'm not saying these things are easy. I'm not saying that they will take place within any given time frame. But militaries and national security establishments are absolutely not doing their job if they're not considering ways in which to infect the supply chain or to hack, via the internet during peacetime, the defense networks of their adversary. Army, Navy, Air Force, espionage, hacking the Kremlin, hacking the White House, hacking Kiev, Jerusalem, Beijing. All of these things happen on a daily basis. And they're not only strategic for espionage purposes, but they're tactical in order to get your code within the networks of your enemy's military, right? Because if conflict takes place between two countries, let's say the U.S. and China, you want to be sitting within their networks such that you could actually turn off their systems. And so I think ultimately we will see these kinds of cyber wars, because I'm a cyber war believer, basically. I know there's a lot of skeptics, but if you think about it, drones, tanks, planes, even soldiers today, they rely on the internet in order to do their job, in order to function. They get intelligence. They target. They sense someone is targeting them. via sensors that exist somewhere on the internet, somewhere in cyberspace. So hackers, if they're operating on behalf of a military, they need to get inside those networks, and they need to be sitting them in order to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks, whether that's denial of service, espionage, or manipulation of data, such that you could turn the ship. Instead of going north, it would go south. Instead of getting bullets in their supplies, they get socks, right? Instead of getting food, they get clothes, right? All of these things are possible, and it just depends on actually realizing these attacks. Even the cyber war skeptics have to understand that all of these attacks are possible, and basically it's just a matter of pulling the trigger on such operations at the right time, right, in sort of a creative mode in which it will be difficult for the defender to see. Beyond that, you may see, for example, let's say China wanted to invade Taiwan. One of the first things that might happen is the lights would go out in New York City, right? That's far away from Taiwan. But basically, if the lights go out in New York City, you will see the White House 100% focused on restoring power in New York City, and it will be very difficult for the White House to manage a war in the Western Pacific, because you've only got so many eyes, so much resources and time available on your national security staff, right? Lights going out in New York City, frankly, is going to be a lot more important to the White House than lights going out in Taipei, Taiwan, right? And so the internet, because it's this global network of networks, if you're China or the United States or Iran or Russia or Ukraine, you can think in terms of attacking targets anywhere on the globe that would distract your opponent, that would incapacitate your opponent in order to defend their space, even if that battlefield is somewhere else on the globe.
What do you think about the possibility of testing of such technologies in the upcoming war in Syria? As we know, Saudi Arabia and Turkey are preparing for a ground operation, and Russia has been already with their forces.
Yeah, well, if I had the time, I wish I could do the same book we did for Ukraine on the cyber dimension of the crisis here in Ukraine. Absolutely. I've done some blogging in the past on the Syria crisis and how the internet is being used on all sides to conduct espionage or to deny service within military networks. There is no doubt that you could write the same book with more, actually, I think, because it's a really, really hot conflict in Syria in which so many players are active. We've seen the Syrian Electronic Army basically. I did a blog a year or two ago just on, there was 2-week period in Syria in which the Syrian Electronic Army, basically they took down Tango, Viber, and Truecaller. And if you count the number of users, you're into the hundreds of millions easily of users just on those 3 websites, which they successfully compromised. So, because the Syrian Electronic Army operates on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, the cyber implications, basically, from compromising those 3 websites, they could easily lead then to real-world ramifications for reporters, for human rights workers, soldiers, spies on the side that's fighting the government, right? So what you have then is you have communications records between soldiers, spies, journalists within Syria communicating out both directions via any one of those services. You're talking about hundreds of millions of accounts. And all of that information basically would be fed right into the Syrian government's intelligence analysis capabilities. So that's just one example. But when you have Russia, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, so concerned about what's happening in Syria today, you will find there would be no way to count the number of computer network operations that would have been run to this point on behalf of one or other player within Syria.
Maybe some personal question. Did Kenneth explain how did he get to Ukraine a couple of years ago?
Yeah, well, basically, my wife is working at the embassy, so she's a diplomat in consular affairs, working with students and married couples on getting visas to the United States. So that's basically how I'm here. I'm working out of my apartment or in local cafes. I'm what we call a trailing spouse now, which is my wife's career is first, and I'm basically working from home.
Boys, do you have any question?
So I have probably two more questions. So one is serious concerning Internet of Things. We just talked about possible vectors of attack in the future. What do you think of threats evolving for Internet of Things as they start going more and more deeper in our lives?
Well, the speed with which the evolution is taking place in terms of information technology is really overwhelming. It's just not so long ago that we were buying our first computers that were not internet connected, that were large and heavy and were immovable. So then we started getting laptops, and that was a revolution in terms of personal computing. You know, the ability to own your own fast processor and storage capability. Then these were connected to the internet. Now we have smartphones in our pockets, and very soon, I think, you won't even see any device at all. It will either be on your eye or in your ear, somewhere embedded within your body. And it's already, there are studies that suggest, brain waves will be used to pass information in the future. So it's crazy how quickly all of these changes are taking place, given that 100 years ago, none of this could have been foreseen, imaginable. So I think that the Internet of Things basically is going to provide spies in particular. This is already the golden age of espionage, but we're addressing, basically, with IP addresses, new things every day. And security is far behind. Just think of how difficult it was for Microsoft to sort of get caught up in terms of security with Windows. Now we see that cars, for example, they're all internet, new cars are internet capable. But as researchers have shown, there's very little separation or compartmentalization of the software within cars. In other words, your entertainment system is on the same operating system as your brakes and your power to the engine. So what does that mean? It means that somebody, this has been proven in the United States, through the entertainment system can actually shut down your car on the highway. And so when we buy even toys and appliances for our house that have IP addresses, and the opportunity for spies to enter your home and to enter your life through the Internet of Things with very little security in place is rising by the day. And it's similar to when a lot of the books that have been written on network security were written. There was a perimeter at your enterprise. But today, increasingly, it's seen as a good idea, what's called BYOD, bring your own device. You can let people choose, their smartphone and to bring it into the office. And of course, we see this in the United States government with Hillary Clinton and others now. Basically, they were communicating with world leaders just via their smartphone of their choice. And a lot of the conversation, it turns out, were very sensitive. Would have been considered, top secret. But the fact is people have to choose functionality and usability over security, and they do so every day. Now, this gives a lot of what's called surface to attackers to find holes and to find ways into a system. So the Internet of Things is going to provide a large challenge to all of us. The cars, now devices, speak to each other more than humans speak to each other, and before long, cars will be speaking to each other more than humans do. So once these operating systems as well, they're so complicated and so many lines of code that it's hard to guarantee their security in an absolute sense, because the reverse engineering that's required and the validation of code is just too difficult. Now Windows and Linux and Apple, they're sort of huge ecosystems unto their own. And it's hard to say whether or not for certain that you own that space, or is a hacker also living with you somewhere within this territory and communicating back to a mothership somewhere. So it's a huge challenge, I think, and it's something we all have to get comfortable with. I think that we're swimming in devices now. Some of us have more computers and devices that we can keep up with in our body, or at least in our home. So the challenges are incredible, I think, and to some degree I think the philosophers of the internet age are correct in saying that the era of privacy is over. We just don't know that we have security today, and that we had better be ready to share our lives with the world. And if somebody, again, they have your through social media accounts, they can see so much about you. They sort of know your political persuasion, your sexual persuasion, the history of your friend associations and professional associations, and it's kind of dangerous already to be applying for a job, because you can see your prospective employer can read all about your history if you have a healthy social media life. So it's a challenge, but we all just have to adapt and evolve along with the internet. But to some degree, I think it's about knowing, if you have a business, for example, it's about knowing the real intellectual property that you need to protect, or the real crown jewels that you have in terms of data, and taking them off the internet, or at least applying your security eyes and ears and mechanisms to a subset of your data that you really don't want to lose.
Okay, and my last question also will be a little bit personal. You told about your students and your children, about their talents and the ability to get more information that we can get, and do a lot of things that we cannot unfortunately do, because they are young and the opportunities are quite wider. Do you see your children as cyber security experts?
Not at all. I think probably spies, they probably prey on this every day, because older people, and even your average internet user, or younger people, they're just not thinking about security. Really they're relying on Google and Apple and Microsoft to provide them some level of security, which doesn't really exist. So, my kids, I have one child who is very interested in information technology and is doing coding, but I think is also very trusting of free games online, very trusting of websites that would apparently be educational in nature, but could easily be set up by organizations that are just interested in preying on the naivety of younger people in terms of security. So I know in the United States, for example, we've had this problem for years of telemarketers or researchers, basically, and they prey on older people, right? They take advantage of older people because, they need someone to talk to, or they get excited about free opportunity for a free carton of milk at the grocery store. And so they will talk to them online, and what they're doing basically is taking advantage of their age and their need for friendship in order just to take money from them, actually. And what they're doing is trying to get them to somehow give up financial details or money in terms of investing in something that is a bad investment, basically. I think criminal organizations as well as spies probably really take advantage of children and older people. And even the average internet user, frankly, knows very little about security. It's a challenge, I think, for all of us. But then again, I think our kids are very much used to having less privacy than we ever had. They like posting details about their lives and the parties they go to and the conversations they have at school online. And that's something we, of course, never did as younger students in the previous generation. We didn't have these tools. But of course, today, students, they need at least to learn about the dangers, right? They need to know that if you post something online, it's really, in some degree, it's probably going to be there forever.
Thank you.
There's a few standard questions we have. Kenneth, what do you think? What can you say about prognosis for the coming year? What can we wait for, or maybe will some big attack will again?
Yeah, I think some issues it will become clearer that, for example, elections will be seen to be vulnerable to hacking and to manipulation, even if only in the information space, and that we need to take some measures to, from an international perspective, to help the election processes around the world be fairer and more open. Right? Estonia is a good place to look to as an example because they have the highest percentage of online voting of anywhere in the world. And also, prior to every election, they red team their election from a security perspective in order to find vulnerabilities and to see where there might be issues to fix. So, in politics, I think we need to be investing in technologies information technologies that will help to foster integrity and transparency so that during government affairs, international affairs, and elections, people sense that there's a greater understanding of what's happening. And unfortunately, I think the current election process in the United States has been surprising to people, that it's unpredictable. But also there's some fear that money basically is pushing all the buttons, right, in everyone's own personal direction that they're taking in politics, right? And this should be an example for all of us of the dangers, I think, of election processes. And so anywhere in the world, I think, there needs to be a greater focus on integrity and transparency of code and of online services, basically. And those can be national or international. But for example, Google, when you type in Google, where should I eat tonight? I'm hungry. Well, part of the problem is Google giving you an objective opinion, or are they just telling you that you should eat at the advertiser who's paying them the most money? My guess is usually it's the latter. It is the company that's paying the most money is getting the recommendation to you where you should eat tonight. Somehow, Google should do more to demonstrate to us that they're giving us an objective opinion, as should politicians and generals. For a long time, for the last generation or so, I think basically generals who are in charge of armies are beginning to understand that the internet is providing a check on what they do and how they run their affairs, because digital photography, as well as the ability of local bloggers and NGOs to cross-examine what governments would say about what's happening within a war space, within a national security space. This is all really good from a historical perspective, because a president or a general can't just tell you what is the true story happening on the field of battle. There will be plenty of other people who are actually documenting what's happening, and much more in real time will be able to challenge the viewpoint of any government. So this is also, I think, really important, and it's all changing really underneath our feet today. But I think in the coming year or two, again, in the national security space, in the electoral space, the government space, lies and manipulation, hopefully, what I want to say is we should be investing in technologies that will help us to discover lies and discover information operations and falsehoods, and help us to see the truth and more transparency in information in internet news. And I'm not saying that's easy or necessarily going to happen without difficulty, but I'm hoping that the internet is not only good for liars, but also truth tellers, and gives us a chance to cross-examine information, to peer review information, so that it's clearer and more understandable what's happening.
May you recommend one book except yours, to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I really do like, I'm very much enjoying all of the documentaries that are taking place today. So I know, for instance, Vice News is coming to Ukraine soon, and they want they're looking at Ukraine now as everyone used to flock to Estonia to see what happened in 2007. You're going to see a lot of reporters and researchers and analysts coming here to do the same thing. But a lot of documentaries out now on Snowden, or on the NSA, or on Russia, or on Ukraine, on Estonia for a while. What they're looking at is how the internet and how hacking is being used by governments to promote political, military coercion or operations within national security space, within political space. And I think the human rights side of it is very important to keep our eye on, because governments can easily use the internet not only for disseminating information, but also for surveillance, right? We really have to remember that there's never been a tool like the internet to gather information as a citizen, but also for the government to surveil citizens and to apply political pressure on citizens. So there's a lot of documentaries and books out now that are highlighting declassified information, whether it's been leaked or stolen or has just come out over time through legitimate sources. But there has been a lot of documentaries and a lot of freedom of information, let's say, websites. And it's really important, I think, that we look at these things. And I'm not saying that it's always good that someone like Snowden sometimes can take information and publish it too quickly, in that they're not paying attention to the dangers that it could cause to legitimate sources. But with the Arab Spring, for example, I know that WikiLeaks, a number of things that WikiLeaks had published, helped to kick off the Arab Spring. Now, in retrospect, the Arab Spring doesn't look so good. But hopefully from a long-term perspective, in terms of a historical perspective, I think transparency in publishing more information rather than less is going to be good from a historical perspective for human rights, transparency, government, accountability, and responsibility. You know, because corporations, people, governments, they all need some privacy, some degree of privacy in which to operate, because you don't necessarily want everyone to know all of your thoughts all the time, right, as a human being. But I think, for example, Wikipedia is an ideal example of how the internet has given us so much of what we didn't have before, which is different perspectives, peer-reviewed information, and that's precisely why, for example, in China, I just talked to a good friend of mine who just came back from China, was surprised to find out how much does not exist within the Wikipedia sections that he was looking for from there, right, is heavily censored. I'm not saying that all the time governments are not concerned about, you know, governments are always ill-intentioned, but in the case of China, for example, he was shocked to find out how much would not come up and does not exist within their space. It is simply does not exist within their information space to search on certain things, Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen Square, etc. So that's the kind of thing that at least should be you know, known and evaluated and understood. And when I asked him to his friends in China understand what is missing, he said absolutely. He said they get it. They can see things pop up and disappear, and they're aware of the manipulation of the information space within China. So I do really enjoy watching documentaries today, and freedom of information groups, software, campaigns, websites, because I think that's good for all of us, really. There's too much autocracy, too much oppression in the world, and lack of human rights. But I'm hoping that the internet, from a historical perspective, basically will help us to move beyond, I think, to move to a more humane civilization in the future with greater accountability and responsibility on the part of our governments.
Okay, and 2 last questions. Please describe yourself with 3 words.
3 words. I don't know. What I like right now is research, publication, and objectivity. I mean, I'm not saying I am those things, but I like those things. And so I really enjoy doing research, working with students. And what I want to do is somehow figure out how to do better research, analysis, and publication.
And what contact I can publish to our listener? Maybe Twitter or email?
Yeah, I think Twitter, is probably just as good as anything. Yeah, I don't know, but my email is pretty easy to find, actually. I'm on Gmail. But but Twitter for sure. You know, I try to tweet things that I think are interesting from a historical, scientific perspective, information technology perspective. You can always reach me there, I think, pretty easily. And as well as the after class on Wednesday afternoons in Kiev. A lot of times we have coffee near Taras Shevchenko. Yeah, I'm not that hard to get in touch with, actually, and I'm happy to talk to researchers, whether they're in the U.S., or Iran, Russia, China, or Ukraine, because I think, again, working together on IT security. Basically just looking at historical issues, how to use IT for better governance, for information sharing between people. I'm very much interested also in linguistic issues. Like I said, I study Russian, but it's not easy to be good at it, I don't think, unless you were born into it. But yeah, current events, I very much like current events, and I'm not a hacker or a coder. In fact, I've had tons of IT courses, but I've never been good at it at all. What I do like are current events and analysis of current events, things like elections, wars, espionage, international relations, basically, and as they're played out within cyberspace. And so one of the things I've looked at for many years is not the bits and bytes of hacking, but how hackers would take advantage of vulnerabilities within computer networks in order to accomplish real-world objectives, like manipulating an election, facilitating a surprise attack within the military space, or spying on the White House, for example. Things like that.
I don't have a question anymore. Victor, you?
No.
Okay, Kenneth, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and pleasure.
Okay, see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.